He lit the entire world, and yet some say he died regretting the wars he started. Films like The Current War and Tesla captured fragments of the man, his brilliance, his pride, his ruthlessness. But even they could not fully explain what drove him. America, in the second half of the 1800s, was a country of raw and restless energy. Steam engines pulled iron across open prairie. Gas lamps flickered in the crowded streets of young cities. Telegraph wires hummed with the pulse of a new commerce. It was a world balanced on the edge of transformation, waiting quietly for someone to push it over. Into this age stepped Thomas Alva Edison, born in 1847 in Milan, Ohio, the youngest of 7 children. A boy who asked so many questions that his school teacher called him addled. A boy who went partially deaf in his early teens and turned that silence into something the world had never quite seen before. He did not invent things the way poets write poems alone. In a single, solitary flash of inspiration, he built the world's first industrial research laboratory. He hired chemists and machinists and mathematicians. He worked them through the night and slept on lab benches himself. He was the father of mass invention, not just of single ideas, but of the entire process of creating them, one after another on a schedule. Like a factory of the mind, he gave the world the phonograph, the practical incandescent light bulb, the motion picture camera, over 1,000 patents in a single lifetime. The name Edison became, in a very real sense, synonymous with the future itself, and yet the man behind the name was something more complicated than a legend. He could be stubborn, ruthless, willing to use fear and spectacle as weapons in a business war. There were choices he made and things he did that dimmed his own light just as surely as the one he gave to others. The myth says, wizard. The man says, something harder to forgive and harder to forget. How does a man who lit the world die alone with regrets? Maybe the same way all of us do, by holding too tightly to the things that were already slipping away. Thomas Edison would ask, what would you sacrifice to leave something permanent behind? Please subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. It truly helps. Now, back to the story. Milan, Ohio, 1840-7. A small canal town, quiet and flat, the kind of place where the wind moves through without stopping. The Huron River slides past the edge of town without hurry. Wheat sits in barrels at the docks waiting. Everything here is waiting. On the 11th of February, in a modest clapboard house on Choate Street, a boy was born, the 7th child of Samuel and Nancy Edison. They named him Thomas Alva Edison. He was a late child. His brothers and sisters were already grown, or nearly so. His mother, Nancy, was 44 years old when he arrived. She had been a school teacher once in Canada. She believed in books. She believed that a mind, given space and patience, could teach itself anything. His father, Samuel, was a different kind of man. Restless, practical, occasionally reckless. He had fled Canada after taking part in a failed rebellion and crossed into Michigan on foot through the snow in winter. He was a man who understood that the world did not stand still. Not for anyone. Thomas grew up in that contradiction. His mother's stillness, his father's motion. The house on Choate Street was small but not unkind. The town of Milan was alive then. The canal brought grain boats and traders and voices from further away. Young Thomas stood at the edge of the docks sometimes, watching the water move, watching the men load and unload their cargo in the early morning gray. He had questions about everything, about the weights and the ropes, about where the boats went, about why the water always moved in one direction. He asked too many questions. His teacher at the one-room school on the hill said so, plainly, to his mother's face, called him addled, said his mind wandered, said he was difficult. Nancy Edison did not argue. She brought him home instead. She became his school. Her dining table became his desk. She read to him from the histories of Rome and from the natural philosophers. She gave him a copy of Richard Parker's Natural and Experimental Philosophy, a science primer full of experiments a boy could perform himself with simple materials. Thomas read it completely. Then he ran the experiments. Then he ran them again, changing one element at a time to see what would change in the result. He was 8 years old. He kept a notebook, filled it with observations in his careful, cramped handwriting. He was not tidy. He was thorough. There's a difference. The family moved. In 1854, when Thomas was 7, they relocated north to Port Huron, Michigan. Samuel had found opportunity there. He sold lumber and grain and operated a small observation tower that visitors could climb for a fee. The family settled into a larger house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by the flat, cold fields of southern Michigan. Thomas had a basement. He turned it into a laboratory. He gathered glass bottles and copper wire and whatever chemicals he could purchase or borrow from the local druggist. He labeled everything with small squares of paper and a careful hand. He ran small experiments in the cool dark alone while the house above him went about its ordinary life. Footsteps on the floorboards, the smell of his mother's cooking drifting down through the gaps. Thomas working in silence below. Then came the fever. He was 12 years old, or nearly so, when the scarlet fever arrived. It moved through children like a quiet fire that season. Thomas lay in bed for weeks, burning and then still, and then burning again. Nancy sat beside him through much of it, pressing cool claws to his forehead, reading aloud when he was well enough to listen. He recovered. But something had changed. The world had gone quieter. At first it was gradual. Then it was permanent. The damage to his inner ear was complete enough that Thomas would never again hear clearly the way other people heard. Conversations became harder to follow. Music flattened into a pale version of itself. The ambient world, the creak of wagon wheels, the cry of birds, the hum of a town beyond a window, withdrew behind a kind of soft cotton wall. He would later say, in interviews and in letters, that it did not bother him, that it gave him the ability to concentrate without distraction, that the partial silence the world had handed him was, in certain respects, a gift. Perhaps he meant that. Perhaps he did not. It is hard to know what a 12-year-old boy tells himself in order to keep moving forward through the days. What is certain is this: he did not stop. He went inward instead, deeper into his notebooks, deeper into his experiments, deeper into the books his mother continued to place before him with quiet confidence. He read Newton. He read Gibbon's History of Rome. He read whatever he could find at the small Port Huron library. He read by lamplight and by the thin, gray window light of early morning. He was not the kind of boy who needed other voices. He had the voices in the books. And then the railroad came. The Grand Trunk Railway connected Port Huron to Detroit, 60 miles to the south, and ran a daily passenger train between the two cities. Thomas was 12, nearly 13, when he applied for a position as a train butcher. That was the term used, not a butcher of meat, but a vendor of newspapers, candies, tobacco, peanuts, and small goods to the passengers in the passenger cars. He was hired. Every morning before dawn, Thomas boarded the train at Port Huron. He moved through the swaying cars with his wicker basket, selling papers and penny treats to travelers half awake in the early light. At the end of the line in Detroit, he had several hours before the return journey. He used them at the Detroit Free Library, reading at a long wooden table in the cool quiet of the reading room. Then he had a further idea. The train had a baggage car, largely empty on many runs. Thomas negotiated with the crew. He set up a small chemistry laboratory in the baggage car, glass bottles padded and wedged against the rocking of the train, a small spirit lamp. His notebooks, their pages fluttering as the cars took the curves outside Port Huron. He ran experiments on the way to Detroit and on the way back, the flat Michigan landscape blurring past the wooden slats of the car. Then, one day, a bottle of phosphorus tipped and caught fire. The conductor was not pleased. The baggage car laboratory ended, quickly and definitively. But Thomas had already turned his attention to something new. He had been watching, on his hours in Detroit, how newspapers were made. He had observed the typesetters at their cases of movable type, the inky flatbed presses, the way a story traveled from a reporter's pencil to a stack of folded papers on the platform in a matter of hours. He understood the mechanical logic of it, and someone had discarded an old small printing press near the rail yards. He acquired it. He set it up in the baggage car, in the space the chemistry laboratory had vacated. He began printing his own newspaper. He called it the Grand Trunk Herald. It was, as far as the historical record confirms, the first newspaper ever printed on a moving train in the world. Thomas wrote the stories himself, in the plain and practical style of a boy who had read widely and wasted no words. He reported on local events along the line, on rail news, on small items that passengers along the route might find useful or interesting. He printed perhaps 100 copies per issue on small sheets and sold them to passengers for 1 cent apiece. Sometimes $2. He made, by most accounts, a reasonable income from it. More importantly, something had settled in him as a principle. Information had value. If you could move information faster than anyone else, you would always have an advantage. The thin telegraph wire running beside every railroad track, that wire was proof of it. Coded pulses of electricity, traveling from city to city faster than any horse, faster than any steam engine. A message that once required a week to carry by courier now arrived in seconds. Thomas was fascinated by the telegraph. He spent hours beside the operators at the Port Huron station, watching the key, listening to the rhythmic clatter of the sounder, trying to read the pattern in the sound. The station at Mount Clemens, part way along the Grand Trunk line, was managed by a station master named James Mackenzie. He was a careful, methodical man, the kind of man who ran a small station well, without fuss. His young son, Jimmy, liked to play near the platform on summer afternoons. One afternoon in the summer of 1862, Thomas was 15 years old. Jimmy Mackenzie wandered onto the main track just as a freight car came rolling in, unattended, picking up speed down a slight grade. With no one at the brake dot, Thomas saw it from the platform. He dropped his newspaper basket and ran. He reached the boy a moment before the car did. He threw his arms around the child and pulled him sideways off the track. Both of them fell hard into the gravel at the edge. The freight car thundered past in a rush of iron and wind, close enough to stir the dust of the platform. James Mackenzie came running from the station door. He had seen it all. He stood over the boy and his son in the gravel, breathing hard, not sure what to say. He asked Thomas what he could do for him, how he could repay him. Thomas did not hesitate. He said he wanted to learn Telegraph. Mackenzie agreed that same afternoon. Over the following weeks and then months, the station master taught Thomas the Morse alphabet, the technique of the sending key, the particular art of listening to the sounder, hearing one signal beneath the accumulated noise of a busy line. Thomas practiced every hour he could spare, before the morning train, after the evening return, on the platform at Mount Clemens, in the early mornings at the Port Huron station, when the operators were willing to let him sit beside them. He was good at it. He was very good. For a boy who could barely hear the everyday world around him, Thomas Edison became one of the fastest, most accurate telegraph operators along that stretch of the Grand Trunk Line. He found ways to adapt. He learned to feel the rhythm of the code in the vibration of the key itself, to sense the intervals and the pulses not only through his ears, but through his fingers and his wrists. It is said that he pressed the telegraph instrument against his teeth sometimes, letting the clicks travel through bone directly to his jaw, bypassing the failing passages of his inner ear entirely. The world of ordinary sound had partially closed to him. He had found a different door, and he had walked through it. There is a question that follows this part of his story, and it does not resolve easily. Did losing sound teach him to listen differently? Maybe it did. Maybe the partial quiet that the scarlet fever left behind was not only a taking away, but also a kind of clearing, a removal of the ordinary noise of living, so that concentration, so that a different kind of attention could fill the space left behind. Or maybe Thomas Edison simply refused to allow the world's verdict to be the final one. He had been called addled. He had lost his hearing. He had been removed from his own laboratory on a moving train, and he had printed a newspaper. He had saved a boy's life. He was learning the language of electricity, pressing the pulse of it into his fingertips and his teeth, through a partial silence that other people might have called a tragedy. He was 15 years old. He was just beginning. He left Port Huron the way most young men leave their first home, quietly, without ceremony, carrying everything he owned in a single canvas bag. He was 17, perhaps 18. He kept no careful record of such things. The years between Port Huron and New York City would later blur together in his memory, a long procession of telegraph offices, boarding houses, railroad towns, and gas-lit rooms where a young man could sleep on a hard bench and call it good enough. This was the life of the wandering telegrapher. It was not a romantic life, though it sounds like one from a distance. Cold winter mornings in Cincinnati, stiff fingers on a brass key in Louisville, a narrow cot behind the instrument room in Nashville. a borrowed blanket in Indianapolis. Edison moved from city to city the way electrical current moves through wire, always toward wherever work could be found. Wherever there was a key to press and a quiet corner to fill a notebook in the long hours. After midnight, he was not a diligent employee. He was a distracted one. His supervisors would find him bent over a notebook when he was supposed to be copying dispatches. He would rig small devices to the telegraph equipment, experiments, he called them, and forget to monitor the line. He was dismissed more than once. He lost a position in Cincinnati for spilling sulfuric acid through a floorboard onto his supervisor's desk in the office below. He packed his bag. He moved on. There was always another city. The notebooks were the constant. Wherever Edison slept on lab benches, office floors, the wooden pews of church halls rented cheaply by telegraph companies, there was always a notebook nearby. A pencil worn to a short stub, a diagram half finished in the margins beside columns of careful numbers. He was teaching himself electrical theory. He borrowed books he could not afford to buy. He read by whatever light was available. He had almost no formal schooling beyond what his mother had given him at the kitchen table in Port Huron, and he never seemed to feel the lack of it. He had learned something on those trains with his newspapers, something in those quiet hours pressing the key at Mount Clemens. He had learned that the world ran on information, on the price of gold and cotton, on the results of elections, on news of war and harvest. And information moved through wire. Whoever could move it faster and more cleverly would matter. Edison, drifting from city to city in his worn waistcoat and battered hat, intended to matter. He arrived in Boston in 1868. 21 years old. He found work at the Western Union office on Washington Street, the night shift, copying press dispatches. He spoke with a flat Midwestern directness. He was partly deaf and made no apology for it, simply leaning closer when he needed to. In Boston, for the first time, he began to encounter men who spoke seriously about electrical science, about Faraday, about the future being built from wire and current. He began to feel, dimly at first, and then with growing certainty, that he was in exactly the right place. His first patent was for an electric vote recorder. The idea was straightforward enough. Each legislator's seat would carry 2 buttons, one for yes and one for no, and pressing a button would register the vote instantly on a central tally board, collapsing the slow roll call process from hours to moments. He traveled to Washington in the early months of 1869 with his machine crated and a presentation rehearsed. A committee chairman listened to him politely. Then he explained, without apology, that the device would never be adopted. The slow roll call was not an inefficiency to be corrected. It was a political instrument. It gave the minority time to negotiate, to persuade, to delay. Speed, in a legislative chamber, was not a virtue. The machine was perfect. It had no future. Edison rode the train north from Washington and made himself a promise. He would never again devote serious time to an invention unless he was certain that someone wanted to buy it. He had spent 2 years building something technically sound and commercially useless. He would not do that twice. Invent for the market. Solve problems that people are already paying to have solved. He arrived in New York City in the spring of 1869, nearly penniless. He slept on the floor of a battery room in the basement of the Law's Gold Reporting Company, on Lower Broadway, a small kindness offered by a telegraph engineer named Franklin Pope, who had recognized something worth helping in the hollow-faced young man from Ohio. The Laws Company broadcast the current price of gold to brokers across the city. One morning, perhaps 2 weeks after Edison had arrived and made himself quietly useful, the central transmitter broke down entirely. A spring had jammed between two contact wheels. The signal stopped. Brokers' runners gathered at the office door, pressing and demanding. The regular engineer could not be found. Edison studied the machine for 3 minutes, identified the fault, freed the spring, and reset the contacts. When the owner, Samuel Laws, came down to assess the damage, he found the machines running and a young man in a worn waistcoat making notes in a small book. Laws hired him that afternoon at $300 a month, nearly 5 times what Edison had last been paid. Within a year, Edison had left the Laws Company and gone into partnership with Franklin Pope as an independent electrical engineer, and he continued to work on the problem that had occupied the back of his mind since Boston, the stock ticker. Not the basic instrument that existed in various imperfect forms, but a universal version, one that would synchronize itself automatically with a master clock, so that every instrument in a subscriber network displayed the same price at the same moment, without requiring a human operator to reset each machine by hand after any interruption. He built it. He called it the Universal Stock Printer. It was compact, reliable, and self-correcting in ways its predecessors had not been. When the Gold and Stock Telegraph Company sought to acquire the design, its president, Marshall Lefferts, summoned Edison to his office to negotiate. Edison had prepared a figure in his mind, $5,000. He had considered this carefully, weighing reasonable against presumptuous for a 22-year-old with no established firm. He stood in Lefferts's office and found he could not say the number. He asked Lefferts what he thought the device was worth. Lefferts told him $40,000. He was 22 years old. He had slept on workbench tops and battery room floors for 5 years. He had carried his first invention to Washington and been told it was useless. He had arrived in New York with almost nothing, and now a careful man in a well-made suit was placing $40,000 on the table. He said yes. He kept his voice level. He took the money. He used it immediately to open a proper workshop in Newark, New Jersey. He hired skilled machinists. He signed supply contracts. He was no longer a solitary inventor improvising in borrowed rooms. He was an employer, a manufacturer, a man with a payroll. He was 22 years old, and he was already becoming something that had not quite existed before. Not just a man who invented things, but a place designed specifically to invent things, continuously as a matter of professional practice. Some men, when the first real money arrives, slow down. They rest, they take stock. Edison did not slow down. He ordered new equipment for the Newark shop the same week he received the payment. He started several new projects at once. He kept a cot in a back room and used it more than his bed at home. Perhaps profit was the answer. Perhaps it was only ever the next problem. Perhaps for Edison the two were never truly separate. Each sale was simply proof that the next idea was worth building. The $40,000 was real enough. But what he did the morning after he received it speaks more clearly than any sum. He went back to the workbench. He opened a notebook. He began again. He left New York quietly. No ceremony. No announcement in the papers. Just a man in his late 20s, with a small fortune in the bank, a restless mind, and a growing certainty that the city was too loud, too crowded, too full of interruption for the kind of work he needed to do. It was 1876. Thomas Edison was 29 years old, and somewhere in rural New Jersey, in a place called Menlo Park, he was about to build something the world had never seen before. The land was unremarkable. A long, low hill, open sky, a single-track railway station a short walk away, just close enough to receive supplies from New York, just far enough from the noise of the city to allow concentration. He purchased a strip of land from a man named William Carman, 2 acres along the railway line, and he began to build. The main laboratory was a 2-story wooden building, modest from the outside, white-painted clapboard, wide windows along both walls to let in the light. Inside, the second floor was one long open room, 100 feet from end to end, lined entirely with workbenches. The shelves held glass jars and chemical reagents, coils of wire, instruments of every description. At night, the gas lamps burned late. The men who worked there, machinists, chemists, glass blowers, called themselves the muckers. They worked beside Edison directly. No hierarchy at the bench. Only the problem. It was the world's first industrial research laboratory. Not a lone inventor's workshop, and not a university. Something entirely new. A place designed, from the beginning, to produce invention on a schedule. Edison told the reporter he intended to produce a minor invention every 10 days and a major invention every 6 months. People thought he was joking. He was not. The first great result came quickly, not from Edison's own original idea, but from someone else's failure to finish a thing properly. Alexander Graham Bell had patented the telephone in 1876. The device worked. Voices could travel along a wire from one room to another, from one building to another. But the transmission was weak, scratchy, unreliable. The voice faded over distance. Over long lines, it became nearly inaudible. The telephone, in its earliest form, was a curiosity, a demonstration piece, not yet a tool for commerce or for communication across a city, let alone across a country. Western Union understood this problem, and Western Union hired Edison to solve it. He studied it with the methodical patience that had come to define him. The difficulty lay in the transmitter, the component the speaker spoke into. Bell's design used a principle of variable resistance, but the variation was not consistent enough, not sensitive enough, not powerful enough to carry the voice clearly through long runs of wire. Edison worked through material after material. He tested lamp black. He tested plumbago. He tested various carbon preparations in varying densities and configurations. And then, somewhere in the long evenings of 1876 and 1877, he arrived at a discovery that would quietly reshape communication for the next century. A small button of compressed carbon, placed against the diaphragm of the transmitter, modulated the electrical current with extraordinary sensitivity. The voice came through clearly, steadily, over distance, the carbon transmitter. A small thing, physically, a disk barely larger than a coin. But its effect was immense. It made the telephone practical. Western Union paid him generously, and Bell Telephone, recognizing the value of the improvement, eventually incorporated the carbon transmitter into all its instruments. Every telephone made for the following 100 years would carry, in some form, the principle Edison worked out on a bench in Menlo Park. But even as the telephone work concluded, something else was already beginning. It started, as many things at Menlo Park started, from a quiet question about how a machine behaved. Edison had been studying the telegraph still, the instrument he had grown up with, the one he understood in his bones, despite being nearly deaf to its sound. He had noticed that a telegraph relay, when current passed through it, sometimes emitted a faint tone, almost musical. He began to wonder whether that phenomenon could be made to capture sound, not to transmit it over a wire in real time the way a telephone did, but to record it, to fix it, to make it something permanent. The theory led to an experiment. A tinfoil cylinder, a needle, a diaphragm. The needle would indent the foil as sound caused the diaphragm to vibrate. Then the needle would be drawn back to the start, the cylinder turned again, and the indentations would move the needle once more, and the needle would move the diaphragm, and the diaphragm would move the air. Edison sketched the design. He handed it to one of his machinists, John Crucy, and told him to build it. Crucy looked at the sketch and reportedly told Edison that the device would never work. He built it anyway. The date was December of 1877. Edison spoke into the instrument. He recited the first verse of a nursery rhyme, the one that begins with a girl and her lamb. The cylinder turned. The needle played back across the foil, and from the small machine on the bench came a recognizable, if faint and scratchy, human voice. His own voice, speaking words he had spoken only moments before. The phonograph. The word means sound writer in the original Greek. It is a fair name for what it did. It wrote sound. It was the first machine in human history capable of recording and reproducing a human voice. The reaction, when word spread, was something between disbelief and awe. Scientists who visited Menlo Park and heard the device assumed, some of them, that there was a trick involved, a hidden speaker, a concealed telegraphic transmission. Edison demonstrated it repeatedly, showing the mechanism openly, the foil, the needle, the hand-cranked cylinder. There was no trick. The machine simply worked. Newspapers called him the Wizard of Menlo Park. The phrase stayed. He was 30 years old, or very nearly. He had the phonograph. He had the carbon transmitter. He had a laboratory full of men who trusted him and tools that responded well to his thinking. And now he turned toward the problem that had been at the edge of his mind for years. The problem that was not merely a commercial puzzle or a scientific curiosity, but something genuinely larger, the problem of light. Artificial light in 1878 meant gas. Gas lamps on street corners, gas jets inside the homes of those who could afford them. The light was warm but unsteady, the flame requiring oxygen, producing heat and fumes, needing to be lit by hand, extinguished by hand, adjusted by hand. Arc lamps existed, powered by electricity, bright, harsh, blinding things, suitable for lighthouses and large public squares, but not for the interior of a family room. The problem of subdividing electrical light, of making it gentle and practical and safe enough for ordinary domestic use, had defeated every serious researcher who had approached it. Edison announced. In the autumn of 1878, that he would solve it within the year. Investors believed him. J.P. Morgan and others put money into the Edison Electric Light Company. Scientists who had spent years on the same problem expressed, in careful language, their considerable doubts. He began, as always, with materials. The principle of the incandescent lamp was understood by everyone. Pass electrical current through a thin conductor until it glows with heat. The problem was that the conductor burned away almost immediately. The challenge was to find a material that could glow for hours, for days, without oxidizing, without fracturing, without failing. The answer had to involve removing the air, a vacuum inside the glass globe, and finding a filament stable enough to endure the sustained heat without disintegrating. Edison and his team worked through platinum. They worked through platinum alloys. They built better vacuum pumps. They refined the glass envelope. They filled notebooks. They failed, documented the failure, and began again the following morning. And then, in October of 1879, after 14 months of near-daily testing, after more iterations than any of the muckers could accurately recount, they placed inside a lamp a filament of carbonized cotton thread. The lamp burned for 14 hours and 22 minutes without failing. Edison ran further tests. He carbonized other plant fibers, other threads, other grasses. He found that carbonized bamboo from a specific source in Japan produced a filament that could burn reliably for over 1,200 hours. That was the material that would go into the first commercial lamps. On New Year's Eve of 1879, Edison lit up Menlo Park. 40 lamps strung along the paths and inside the buildings of the laboratory complex, powered by a central generator of his own design. Reporters came. Members of the public came, stepping from the train at the Menlo Park station and walking toward a cluster of low buildings glowing with a steady, even, golden light. Not gas, not arc. Something quiet. Something that did not flicker or hiss or smell of combustion. They stood in that light and looked at it. Some of them had traveled for hours to be there. They did not speak very much. There was not much to say. Edison stood among them that night, watching their faces more than the lamps. He had said once, in an unguarded moment, that genius was 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. It was, perhaps, the most honest thing he ever said about himself. The phonograph had come in a flash of intuition, and then in weeks of construction and careful refinement. The light bulb had come after 14 months of failures so numerous. They were measured not in individual disappointments, but in entire filled notebooks. The carbon transmitter had come through systematic elimination of every material that simply did not behave. Menlo Park was not a place of magic. It was a place of repetition, of materials tested, methods discarded, results recorded that would never be published because they led nowhere useful. And then, after all of that, the thing that finally worked, the thing that held its shape under heat and voltage and time, the thing that stayed lit. Maybe Edison never found peace in the finished object. Maybe the long sequence of failures that preceded every success interested him more than the success itself. That is the harder thing to know about him. He stood in the lamplight on the last evening of 1879, and he looked quiet, not triumphant, just quiet and already thinking about what came next. The lamps were still glowing at Menlo Park when Thomas Edison began to understand that invention alone was not enough. The world had seen the light. Now someone had to wire it. In the early months of 1880, he turned away from the laboratory bench and toward the city street. The light bulb was real, was proven, was patented. But a single glowing bulb in a demonstration room was not a business. To make electricity a business, he needed generators, cables, distribution networks, meters, fuses, witches, sockets, an entire invisible infrastructure that would carry power from a central station into every home and counting room that wanted it. He began designing all of it at once, simultaneously, driving his engineers and machinists through 18-hour days with the same relentless energy he had always carried. He was 33 years old, heavier than he had been at Menlo Park, darker around the eyes. He moved with the certainty of a man who had already proven something enormous and intended to prove several more things before the decade was finished. In the autumn of 1882, on a September afternoon in lower Manhattan, Edison stood at a switchboard inside a small red brick building on Pearl Street and threw the switch himself. Power flowed. The first commercial central generating station in the world hummed into life. Within a few city blocks, 85 customers, newspaper offices, counting rooms, a stock exchange, felt their electric lamps brighten without a match, without gas, without flame. Edison walked those streets that evening with one of his engineers, hands in his coat pockets, watching the windows glow above the cobblestones. He said very little. He looked and he counted, and he moved on. Direct current, his current moved in one direction, steady and controllable. He understood it as a carpenter understands a specific wood, its grain, its limits, its particular reliability. He trusted it, and he believed with a conviction that bordered on doctrine that it was the only safe way to carry electricity into homes and public buildings. His generators were built around it. His cables, his meters, his sockets, the entire commercial architecture he had spent 3 years constructing. All of it was built for direct current. But a different current was already moving against him. George Westinghouse, a careful and methodical inventor from Pittsburgh, had acquired the rights to a system of alternating current developed largely by a young Serbian-American engineer named Nikola Tesla. Tesla had, in fact, spent time in Edison's own laboratories in the early 1880s, working long hours on electrical problems before a dispute over recognition ended the arrangement badly. Now Tesla's mathematics and Westinghouse's capital were aligned against everything Edison had built. Alternating current reversed its direction many times per second. It could be stepped up to very high voltages for long-distance transmission and then stepped down again for household use, using transformers. A single generating station could serve a far larger territory than any direct current network could reach. It was cheaper over distance. It could bring electric light to towns and farms that lay miles beyond the practical reach of Edison's system. Edison knew these facts. He chose not to adopt alternating current. The reasons were entangled in ways that are difficult to fully separate, even now. He genuinely believed that high-voltage alternating current was more dangerous than direct current, and at transmission voltages then being used, there was some truth in this. But the financial and personal stakes were also enormous. To accept alternating current would be to concede that the system he had staked his reputation on was not the system the future would use. He was not constituted for that kind of concession. So he chose to fight, not with better science, with newspapers. Beginning in 1887 and intensifying through 1888 and 89, Edison authorized a campaign designed to associate alternating current with death. Harold Brown, an electrical engineer working with access to Edison's West Orange laboratory, staged public demonstrations in cities across the Northeast, electrocuting dogs and calves before audiences of journalists and city officials. The animals died rapidly and visibly. Brown argued that this was the natural consequence of alternating current, that it was inherently lethal, that Westinghouse intended to run this lethal force through residential streets. Westinghouse was furious. He pointed out accurately that any current at sufficient voltage would produce the same outcome, and that his transmission lines used transformers to reduce voltage before it entered homes. Brown declined a public debate. The campaign continued. Edison remained one step removed from the demonstrations. Though his laboratories provided equipment and his tacit approval was understood, he claimed publicly to oppose capital punishment. Privately, through intermediaries, he suggested that if New York State was going to adopt electrocution as a method of execution, Westinghouse generators would be the appropriate machines for the task, associating his rival's name with the act of killing. He proposed, half seriously, that the new verb for execution by electricity should be derived from Westinghouse's name. The word appeared briefly in several newspapers. It did not survive. In 1890, William Kemmler, convicted of murder in Buffalo, was strapped into the first electric chair at Auburn Prison. The machine used Westinghouse alternating current generators. The execution was slow, badly administered, witnessed by reporters who described it with language that made Westinghouse's published response entirely understandable. He called it a horror. The chair did not end his company. The public moved past it, and Edison, watching the aftermath, could see clearly that the campaign had not shifted the commercial argument in his favor. The financiers around him were reaching conclusions of their own, J.P. Morgan, and the syndicate that had funded Edison's electrical. Companies were not sentimentally attached to direct current. They were attached to returns. By 1891, alternating current systems were expanding faster and more cheaply than Edison's. Thomson-Houston Electric, a competitor that had built much of its business on alternating current components, was profitable and growing. In April of 1892, Edison General Electric and Thomson-Houston were merged to form a new corporation. The new company was called General Electric. Edison's name was removed from the company he had founded. He was paid in shares and moved gently to the side. He was 45 years old. He read about the merger in the newspapers. Those who knew him said he grew very quiet, even by his standards, spending more time alone in the laboratory. He told a journalist later that he was relieved that the business had always distracted him from the real work. There was enough truth in this that it did not sound entirely like a lie. The final chapter of the war came in the summer of 1893. The World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, a fairground of extraordinary ambition built along the shore of Lake Michigan, was illuminated entirely by Westinghouse's alternating current. Westinghouse and Tesla had underbid Edison's company for the lighting contract by a margin that was astonishing even to those who expected it. On the night the fair opened, 100,000 incandescent lamps came on across the fairgrounds at once. The crowd fell briefly silent. Then they cheered. Nikola Tesla demonstrated alternating current in the electricity hall before audiences of thousands. He ran high-voltage current through his own body to illuminate lamps he held in his bare hands, standing calm in the phosphorescent glow. He was 37 years old. He seemed, by those accounts, to be genuinely enjoying himself. Edison did not attend the fair. He was at West Orange working on other things: moving pictures, storage batteries, a cement process, problems that interested him. The current war for him was already becoming the past, something he had fought with everything he had, lost in a specific sense, and was now moving away from as he had always moved, forward and into the next bench covered with wire and glass and possibility. Whether he regretted the campaign, the demonstrations, the electric chair, the lobbying, he never said clearly. He had believed what he believed, fought for it with the tools available to him, and been defeated by the market, by the mathematics, and by the money. In the histories, this chapter is written almost always as Edison's loss. The alternating current grid became the infrastructure of the modern world. General Electric, eventually, adopted the system he had spent years trying to discredit. He had been right about almost everything, across almost 50 years of working. He had been wrong about this. Maybe the hardest thing is not to lose. Maybe the hardest thing is to have been right so many times that you cannot recognize or accept the one time you were not. He had lost the current war, but he had not stopped moving. That was the thing about Edison. He never stopped moving. Not when he was wrong. Not when he was broke. Not even when the world had moved on without him. He was 46 years old in the summer of 1893. His name had been stripped from the company he had built. 100,000 alternating current lamps blazed at the Chicago World's Fair, and not one of them was his. He sat at his bench in West Orange, and he turned toward the next problem. He had been thinking about the eye. The phonograph had captured sound, had held it still, had given it back. If sound could be caught and replayed, Edison believed, then so could motion. His assistant, William Kennedy Laurie Dixon, did the careful mechanical engineering. But the vision, the refusal to let the idea die in a drawer, that was Edison's. He called the device the kinetoscope, a wooden cabinet, roughly the size of a wardrobe, with a small glass lens at the top. Inside, a strip of celluloid film looped over a series of spools, illuminated from below by a single electric bulb. You leaned forward, pressed your eye to the lens, and the world inside the cabinet moved. A man sneezed. A woman danced. Two boxers threw punches in a tiny circle of light. They moved. That was the miracle. Edison opened his first kinetoscope parlor on Broadway in New York City on April 14th, 1894. 10 machines in a row, 25 cents a look. People stood in line around the block. Edison believed the Peepo format was the superior model: one machine, one paying customer. He was wrong about that. In December of 1895, the Lumiere brothers in France projected moving images onto a white screen before a paying audience. People watched together. They laughed together. Within 12 months, Projected cinema had swept the world, and Edison's people parlors were standing empty. He adapted. He purchased the Armut Vitascope projector, rebranded it under his own name, and by April of 1896 was projecting films at Coster and Biles Music Hall in New York. He fought patent disputes over film technology for the next 2 decades. In 1908, he helped form the Motion Picture Patents Company, a trust of major producers, an attempt to control the new medium through licensing agreements. Then the independent filmmakers packed their equipment and moved to California, far from his lawyers. They called it Hollywood. It grew up partly as an escape from his control, and it grew into something he could neither own nor imagine. He never liked California. The ore project had begun before the current war was over, born from an obsession that had lived in Edison for years. He believed that low-grade iron deposits existed throughout the granite hills of New Jersey, ignored by the great steel companies because extracting them cost too much. He believed he could change that. He sold his stock in General Electric to fund the mine. He moved to a remote New Jersey hilltop with his workers, sleeping 4 hours a night, driving the machinery harder and harder, redesigning crushers and magnetic separators through the winter dot at its peak. The Ogden facility crushed 50,000 tons of rock per day. The whole system was a marvel of mechanical integration, and its economics were fatal dot in 1894. The Messaby Iron Range was opened in Minnesota. Beneath the surface of a broad and gentle plain lay one of the largest deposits of soft iron ore ever found, nearly pure, lying almost at the surface, requiring nothing more than a steam shovel and a rail car. The price of iron ore collapsed within months. Edison's carefully calibrated process was suddenly 3 times more expensive than ore being shoveled out of an open field in the Midwest. He had spent perhaps $2 million, perhaps more. He spoke of it later with equanimity. "I never felt better in my life," he said of those years at the mine. The failure had not broken him, but it had aged him. He returned to West Orange carrying something quieter than grief. He turned to cement. He designed a new rotary kiln, nearly 150 feet in length, and founded the Edison Portland Cement Company in 1901. He also developed plans for entire houses cast from a single continuous concrete pour. Living room, staircase, bathtub, all formed at once from custom iron molds, assembled and filled in a single day. He offered the design free to any builder willing to use it. 11 houses were eventually built in Union, New Jersey, around 1917. They still stand today, quiet and gray, a small neighborhood that nearly changed how a country was built, and then did not. His storage battery work was longer and more genuinely successful. He spent 10 years testing combinations of nickel and iron electrodes in alkaline solution, filing over 140 patents. By 1910, the Edison alkaline battery was in production, superior to the lead-acid cell in durability and weight. He had designed it partly for the electric car. By the time it was ready, Ford's gasoline-powered Model T had already sold in the millions and decided the question for a generation. Henry Ford had been a young engineer when he first met Edison at a conference in Manhattan in 1896. Ford had been working on his gasoline combustion engine, uncertain whether the idea had a future. Edison brought his fist down on the table and said, "Young man, you have it. Keep at it. Ford kept at it. He revered Edison for the rest of his life. In 1929, for the 50th anniversary of the incandescent lamp, Ford reconstructed the entire Menlo Park laboratory at his Greenfield Village Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. Every building, every bench, the soil beneath it, transported by rail from New Jersey and laid down again in Michigan. Edison came at 82 years old, visibly tired, leaning on Ford's arm. President Herbert Hoover attended. The ceremony was broadcast nationally by Radio Dot in his final years. Edison spent his days at Glenmont in New Jersey and at his winter home in Fort Myers, Florida. Diabetes had weakened him steadily. He moved more carefully now. His hair had gone entirely white. His face was deeply lined. He still gripped his pencil in an ink-stained hand. He still went to the laboratory. Congress awarded him the Congressional Gold Medal in 1927. He received a specially created civilian Medal of Honor in 1920-8. He kept working. Ford and Firestone asked him to find a domestic source of rubber for American industry. He tested more than 17,000 plant species for rubber content. He settled on goldenrod, the ordinary yellow roadside weed, cultivated it, hybridized it over several growing seasons, produced plants over 12 feet tall with a meaningful rubber yield. He was still working on it in the summer of 1930-1. He never finished it. On the 12th of August, 1931, Edison collapsed at his West Orange laboratory. His family gathered. His wife, Mina, stayed at his side. He drifted in and out of awareness through the weeks that followed. The great machine of him winding slowly down at 9:31 in the evening on October 18th, 1931. Thomas Alva Edison died at his home in Llewellyn Park, New Jersey. He was 84 years old. He held 1,093 patents. No inventor in the history of the United States has ever held more. The following evening, at 10 o'clock, at the request of President Hoover, the electric lights of America were dimmed for 1 minute in his honor. Times Square, the great railroad stations, the bridges and the quiet lamps of 1,000 small towns across the continent, all of them briefly dark. Then they came back on. They have never gone off again. He spent his whole life lighting the world. At the end, maybe the most honest thing anyone could do was turn the lights off for a moment, just to feel what he had saved us from. If you are still awake, if the room around you is quiet now, let yourself feel the warmth of the light beside you, that steady glow you have never once had to think about. Someone spent 1,000 failures to give you that. A deaf man in a dusty laboratory, working through the night, trying again. Let the long story settle into silence. The lights will hold until morning. Sleep.